welcome to my session about the core Web Vitals, their what, why, and how, more specifically. So this is a testing conference, and I'm always a little humbled to speak at testing conferences because I'm not that much into the testing space anymore. I do write tests when I write my code, but you all are probably more experts here than I am. Nonetheless, testing your website performance is an important thing, and the core Web Vitals are a tool to accomplish exactly that. So I think it makes sense to discuss these things. I'll look with you at three different things tonight. First things first, we'll talk about web performance, or what website performance actually is. We'll talk about the core Web Vitals, and then we also will talk about how the core Web Vitals will contribute to Google search in the form of the page experience signal launching in May. So there are some SEO implications or search engine optimization implications from this as well. So let's start with what is website performance. Well, intuitively, we all know the answer to this question. Is a website fast and delightful to use or not? But if you want to compare that between sites, and maybe even between different versions of the same site, it becomes a lot more tricky because you want something that you can compare and track over time, and intuitive measurements don't really help and don't really tick that box. So the goal is to quantify it, right? To have some sort of number or metric that we can get that tells us if a website is fast and delightful for a user to use or not. And as we will see in this talk, this has evolved over time and continues to evolve even today, as our understanding of what makes a website fast and performant and delightful for users changes over time, and also the web changes and the kind of websites we build are changing. So there won't be an easy answer. That's kind of like the spoiler alert. But let's have a look at this, right? So how could we quantify web page performance? Well, one of the earliest metrics has probably been the time to first byte. So we would measure how long it takes for the first byte from the server to come back to our computer or device, and actually the browser can then start parsing and then eventually rendering the page. And historically, this has made a lot of sense. So a classical website, like here, this example.com case, our browser would make a request, the web server would respond with the HTML, and then the content would be visible in the browser. There are huge differences, and there are a few things and factors that we can influence as website owners and developers to make sure that this is still fast. Like, we make sure that our server is fast, has enough memory, has enough capacity, has good network bandwidth. We can also make sure that the server is close enough, physically close enough, because it just physically takes time for data to, or like electrical or light impulses to travel, right? If I'm here in Switzerland, the server is in Australia, then this might take a while until the data has made its way to Australia and comes back. It might be lost on the way and then has to be retransmitted. So this can take a significantly longer time than when the server is, for instance, in my own city. I'm living nearby a data center, so maybe if it's located there, then it's literally just taking basically no time at all. It's going to be really, really quick, and thus the time to first byte will be a lot shorter than it would be with a server in Australia. But is this an exhaustive good metric? Is this all we need to quantify if a website is fast and delightful? No, and that's partially because the website architecture has changed over time, but also because bandwidth and connection speeds are not necessarily the biggest bottleneck anymore. So let's look at two websites. I open both websites on the same machine at the same physical location at the same time, and I have maybe I have two machines next to each other going through the same internet connection. Doesn't really matter. I go to a.example.com and b.example.com, and we assume that these are completely separate servers and completely separate web applications. So these requests go out, and a.example.com takes a while. Maybe it's like a classical PHP or Java or Python or Ruby program that needs to run on the server. Maybe it is a server-side rendered application that needs to talk to a bunch of backends and APIs and databases to actually fetch the data and then compile the HTML before sending it over the wire. Doesn't really matter. The point is, it takes a moment. It doesn't matter how long this moment is, it just takes a moment. Whereas b.example.com, on the other hand, has received a request, immediately responds back, and the time to first byte has arrived. And it's HTML that says, load this piece of JavaScript. And now, the next second, a.example.com responds with the full HTML. It has done all the things that it needs to do on the server. And my browser shows me the website. Whereas with b.example.com, we are now at the stage where we get the app.js, which then comes back and then probably like starts rendering or starts running the JavaScript. Once the JavaScript starts running, it discovers, oh, we need to make these bunch of API requests, then makes API requests, and these come back, all while the browser still has nothing substantial to show to the user. Now, which of these two websites is better, more delightful, and faster, according to a user looking at both browser windows? Well, very clearly a.example.com. But if you remember originally, according to the metric of time to first byte, a.example.com was the slower one. It took longer until we received the first byte of the response. But as we received it, the response was more complete than the other response. So time to first byte is not good enough these days. And it has not really been a useful metric. It is still relatively useful because it helps you if you see like, oh, my website is slow. And you see like, actually, the rendering itself is really fast and we don't have to wait that much until things are being painted. It's just the connection time and the time it takes for the data to go over the wire and come back. Then that's the bottleneck that you need to fix, and you can fix that by using a CDN or something. But point being still, that metric is not sufficient. If you just look at time to first byte and say like, what, my server responded in 0.1 seconds, and the data was there in like 0.5 seconds, how can this be slow? You might miss out. And that's why we have looked at many, many metrics. For instance, speed index, where we try to figure out, okay, so not just like, when is the website there, when is the network part of it mostly done, but when do things start to pop up, and how long does it take over time to near visual completion? Then we looked at first contentful paint, how long does it take to get the first bit of the content actually visible on the browser window? Excuse me. And then we had tons of other metrics over time to track different aspects. And it's not just about when does stuff start to show up. Imagine you're having an online shop for pizzas. You want a pizza delivered to your place. It shows up really quickly. The menu is there in like no time, in the blink of an eye. Fantastic. But then you're like, I want this pizza. I want this pizza. Hello, I want this pizza. You click, 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 click. And after 5 seconds, suddenly you have 100 pizzas in your cart. That's not delightful either. So we also looked at other metrics like time to interactive. When can I actually start to interact with the content? And a lot of other metrics. And this has evolved over time in random intervals. It seems like at some point someone was like, actually, you know what? This metric doesn't really reflect what we looked for or what the users experience. So we came up with this new metric, and then someone else was like, that's a great metric, but it also needs to basically take into account this other aspect, as I said, for instance, interactivity. And thus we have not only one metric that we look at, but we look at a set of metrics, which unfortunately also makes this more complicated, not only to understand, but also to communicate with others. So if you are communicating with users and you say like, you have a Lighthouse score of 100 out of 100, that really doesn't mean that much to them. However, they might say like, oh, it's only 80 of 100, 80 out of 100 possible points. That still does not really say much, because are these last 20 points really a problem, or is that just like cosmetic? So measuring performance is actually a big challenge, as it turns out. One thing is that we want metrics to be relatively stable, but also fine enough and sensitive enough to really spot problems when they occur. We had a metric called first meaningful paint that tried to figure out when the meaningful part of the content was showing up, and that usually was very janky. So that means that you would have the same website, you would measure 3 times, you would get 3 different results without changing anything in the circumstances. So that's not really helpful. You want a metric that is comparable over time and more or less stable. It will never be 100% stable, but you know, you don't want to pick too sensitive ones. You don't want to pick too rough ones where you don't like time to first byte. It's a very, very broad, rough metric. Doesn't really reflect things either. And also, these metrics really need to reflect the actual user experience. I said that already with the time to interactive. We needed a way to actually track these things as well. Also, we would like data to be able to be generated in lab settings where we can run these things automated and with things that are not necessarily already public. If we can only gather real user data, that is a little tricky. But it would also be nice to get real user data to get a feeling for how this actually looks like on real people's machines and connections. Because we, with our high-end computers and good, stable, fast internet connection land, might not be the target group of our website, and then people on phones, on flaky connections might have a very, very different experience. So it would be cool if our metrics could be measured in both contexts. Another big thing was that as we were changing the metrics, because our understanding of performance changed over time, you might end up working on improving a metric and then finding that this metric fell out of favor. And then we have looked at other metrics, and now you're like, ooh, our score is constantly increasing, and then it drops, and you're like, why? Have we done something wrong? Which also puts you in the uncomfortable position that whoever you're reporting to might ask for these metrics, and then if your metrics are now lower than they have been as you started the initiative to make things faster, that might not be very comfortable. So we needed to change a few things. And we figured out that one approach would be to basically get vital signs for the web. These are called the core web vitals. But what are these? Well, they are basically 3 metrics for web developers and testers and SEOs to look at to figure out how the user experience in terms of performance is on each page, and to measure that and to work reliably on improving them as well. The data is already in pretty much all the tools that we provide at Google. So it's in Lighthouse, which is in the Chrome DevTools. It's in PageSpeed Insights. It's in the Google Search Console Web Vitals report. There's web page tests as well. And there's also the JavaScript APIs in Chrome that you can use to measure these things in the real user setting. The goals for the thresholds that we are using to judge if websites are doing well, need improvement, or are doing poorly are based on field data that we gathered and analyzed. So these metrics can and are already being achieved by lots of websites. Even though you might not necessarily hit the targets yet, you can achieve them. That is definitely possible. And also to fix the moving goalpost issue, we will roughly update them every year. So we published them in May last year, 2020, and we will probably give an update on them at Google I/O this year as well. And then it will, again, roughly be a yearly cadence for us to review the thresholds and the metrics. So what are these 3 metrics that make up the core web vitals? The first thing measures visual completeness. So how long does it take until I actually see what I care about? What's the main content? How long does it take to show up? That's measured by the largest contentful paint metric. It's basically the visual loading time that we had measured with other things beforehand. And a good measure would be less than 2.5 seconds. If you're getting your main content visible within 4 seconds, that is in the needs improvement area. Everything that takes longer than 4 seconds has an impact on how users perceive your site. So we would recommend to make the website faster then. The second metric, as I hinted at with the pizza shop example, is how long does it take until I can actually interact with the web application. We measure that in the first input delay. You want to make sure that the page responds to user inputs. You can accomplish that by using less JavaScript or shifting it off the main thread or delaying it otherwise. And you want to be under 100 milliseconds because that feels very basically immediate to the human brain, whereas a 300 millisecond delay feels like slightly sluggish, but still relatively instantaneous. Everything that takes longer will eventually cause a disconnect or a feeling of disconnect between the action and the reaction. So that's something that you want to keep an eye on as well. Last but not least, we also want to make sure that the page content is visually stable. What does that mean? Well, it means how much does it move around. You probably know this if you're on your phone or on your computer and you see a website shows you a button and you want to interact with that button. But then before you can click on that button, something else moves and then a new thing is there and you click on that and you're like, no, I didn't want to interact with this. Why did that happen? We measure that with a new metric called cumulative layout shift. And it's basically how much of the content shifted and by how much did it shift. that value should be below 0.1, because everything between 0.1 and 0.25 is considered okay. Everything that is more than that is definitely considered a problem. What are these values? To be fair, I don't really have found the unit that I should use because it's not really percent, but it's basically the way you calculate it is how much of the page is affected by the shift and by how much does it shift. So in this case, for instance, we have a website that has two halves, right? The gray half and the green half. After a while, a button pops into the middle of the page, which means the entire lower half shifts. So 50% of the page is affected by the shift. And the button and some spacing that it introduces is roughly 14% of the page. So it is affected by 14%. So we can multiply the 50%, that's the affected area, by the 14% that it shifts. And that gives us 7%. It's not really percent, but like 0.07 is the value we get if we multiply 0.5 with 0.14. So 0.07, that would be within the acceptable range, actually. Assuming that this button would now be on the top of the page, everything on the page would shift, so 100% of it would shift. It would probably still be shifting by 14%, so that would be 0.14. That is above the threshold already. So you can see that either large amounts of space that are taken after the fact that, or after the first rendering, or a shift that moves everything on the page. Both of these are being taken into account as problematic shifts anyway. What can you do in regards to the Core Web Vitals? web.dev/vitals has lots of information. Learn what you want to learn about these metrics, understand what they do, how they are measured, and how you can improve on them. It's very, very useful to know how this works. Test all your different page versions. If you have a mobile, desktop, and AMP page version of your content, then test all three of these or any combinations. And do look into integrating it into your automated flow, because that's really, really helpful. It also has impact on Google Search, or will have impact on Google Search. There will be a new signal called page experience. In May 2021, we want to launch this new ranking signal that is comprised or composed from existing ranking signals. So we take things like mobile friendliness, safe browsing, HTTPS, and intrusive interstitials, which are already ranking factors, and remove the proprietary page speed variation that we use to measure in ranking with the Core Web Vitals measurements, and combine these into a signal called the page experience signal. Page speed and mobile user experience are not new ranking factors. They have been beforehand, so it's not something that you need to super much worry about. It is just something to be aware of. And both the page speed using the Core Web Vitals and the others that I just mentioned will form this new page experience signal that will happen in May. One of the upsides is that once this page experience signal has launched, we know how fast different pages are, and we will no longer require AMP to be, AMP is no longer a requirement to show up in the top stories carousel. So if you're a news site and want to have your articles in the top stories carousel, once the page experience signal has launched, AMP will not be a requirement to show up in there anymore. What can you do for these things? What if people in your organization are worried about the page experience update? Don't be worried about it. It's not like a huge update. It is an update, but it's not like the biggest we've done. Do check your pages. Make sure that there's no Core Web Vitals issues, that there are no mobile friendliness issues, no safe browsing issues. You can use the Search Console. That's a free tool we put out there. You can go to search.google.com/console, sign up, get a feeling for how your pages are doing, and use the Core Web Vitals report as well as the mobile friendliness test to figure out where there's areas for improvement and work on those. If you want to learn more, feel free to ping us on Twitter at Google Search C, or ping me on Twitter as Geekonaut. You can also check out our documentation at developers.google.com/search, which has a load of information. And we also run a YouTube channel with regular office hours on youtube.com/Google Search Central. With that, I'd like to say thank you so much for watching and listening. and bring on your questions. I'm really excited to hear what you are up to.